Well, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. In the wake of the Biden visit, it has caused some of us to focus in on what looks to be two very different strategies to reduce emissions, create cleaner fuel, and of course, environment. The U.S. tends to have a system of rewarding people for having greener activity. And we keep talking in this country about, the punishment, the dire sacrifice and warnings that come from government. They're incentivizing new industries that actually create jobs as well as make potentially a greener future. We have relied heavily on the carbon tax, and now in the processes of April 1st of hiking that again. So where are we on some of the future issues surrounding this? Critical minerals, we'll take a look at that a little bit later on. Are we really ready for all that's been promised with EVs? We don't have charging capacity or batteries. So if we overload that electricity grid, it's going to be difficult. Hence the discussion with our first guest today, Kirsten Marcia. She is the president and CEO and founder of Deep Earth Energy Production Company. It's a corporation that intends to develop Saskatchewan's geothermal resources. So that's the connection. This is a way to create more electricity in a much more cleaner way, which we're going to need if we're going to do all that other stuff. So Kirsten is a resource entrepreneur. She's a geologist, and of course, she's from Saskatchewan. So what other good? Welcome. It's great to meet you.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor to meet you, Senator Wallen. Thank you.
Well, we'll go with Pamela and Kirsten. So geothermal, let's walk me through this with baby steps. What is it?
So geothermal is essentially harvesting heat resources that are naturally sourced from very deep in the earth. I think, everyone's got, an aunt or a cousin who's heating their houses with geothermal. Yeah. What we're doing is a little bit different. Those are heat pumps. What we're doing is drilling 3.5 kilometers down into the ground, and then about 3 kilometers horizontally in addition to that, to be able to produce geothermal brine at 120 degrees Celsius, move that to surface, mine the heat out of that brine, and convert it to power.
Okay, I have about 1,000 questions. So this is the first project like this in Canada, and it's in southern Saskatchewan. Tell me sort of where.
So we're near Estevan, which is actually my hometown, closer to the small town of Torquay, but people know Estevan a bit more than Torquay. Yep. It is right along the US border because we're focused on a deep sedimentary geothermal project, which think of Saskatchewan Williston Basin as a stack of pancakes of sediment, right? We've got our fabulous potash resources, we have our fabulous oil and gas resources, and very, very bottom pancake is a sandstone that's filled with hot brine that has been essentially ignored as a resource, because who cares about hot water when you're in the Williston Basin with all of these other resources, right? But certainly at 120 degrees Celsius, there are many global projects around the world that have successfully developed and are producing power today.
So you're just going down, you're going to mine, as you say, you're going to kind of capture the heat and use it to generate electricity directly or indirectly. How does that part of the equation work?
So the technology that we use to actually make the power is called organic Rankine cycle technology. It is deployed globally all around the world. It's used in waste heat facilities, obviously geothermal. In fact, we have 5 ORC power facilities in Saskatchewan already, 4 of them along the Big Alliance pipeline, where there's compression stations that give off huge amounts of heat. They're harvesting that, they're mining that heat and converting it to power. And it's already being sold into the Saskatchewan SaskPower grid. So it's kind of, it's interesting. The way it works is you after you harvest that heat in the heat exchanger, you introduce that heat to a working fluid, in our case, probably butane, and it has the ability to flash at lower temperatures than water does. And that vaporization of the butane is what then turns the turbine and makes power. It's a closed loop cycle. You're constantly recycling the butane. And from a resource perspective, the same thing goes with the geothermal brine. We're producing that hot fluid, again, mining the heat out. It goes back into the ground at approximately 60 degrees Celsius. But those wells are spaced a far distance away from where they're being produced. So they have time to slowly trickle through that sandstone, reload with heat so that it's continually produced at 120 degrees Celsius.
So this is the obvious benefit over wind and solar, which are so dependent on weather and sun and birds and any number of things. This one is kind of a self-enclosed system. So you're also not putting out any bad stuff, any emissions.
There's no emissions, and even just as importantly, it's baseload power, which is to your point, it's not intermittent like wind and solar.
Right.
It's on 24/7, whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. And it's an important difference. I mean, wind and solar obviously has a great seat at the table. But I think what people often forget is that for every megawatt of wind and solar we build, we have to build that same capacity in natural gas to back up that wind and solar.
Right.
We, like you're speaking with Mike Crabtree later.
Yeah.
We work a long time with the Saskatchewan Research Council. What people forget, or maybe don't realize, the Saskatchewan Research Council is the largest research council in Canada after Natural Resources Canada. So we're very proud of that resource here in Saskatoon. But we did work to find out what can we use to run our pumps, for example. We use wind and solar and battery storage, and the numbers are huge. In order to get that same base capacity, the numbers are astounding as to how much actually has to get built compared to just geothermal on a standalone basis, just hums 24/7.
So the other competitor on this, and we won't, I don't really care, but I mean the small nuclear reactors, they seem to be the other one that have a small footprint and don't need all that other stuff once you build them. So that's where you're at. You're kind of offering a standalone option.
That's right. And SMRs, at some point in the future, when they are established and running in Canada, they'll be a great energy solution.
Right.
But they are sometime in the future.
Yeah.
What we're doing today is standard oil and gas drilling, using pre-existing expertise from the oil and gas sector.
Right.
And there's no retraining involved. We are very much an oil and gas fluid production company with no oil. So everything that is being developed proudly here in Western Canada, we can redeploy that for the first time ever on a renewable energy project.
It seems like you're the answer to the just transition question, which is you've got people trained up to do the job. It's just a different resource.
I like to use the word diversification.
I'm sure you do. Nobody wants to use just transition.
We need all energy sources, right? I mean, our oil and gas resources are required. We have the cleanest, most sustainable produced oil and gas resources probably in the world. And all of those resources have a seat at the table. But we need more power, right?
Yeah,
we're growing. We're going to see 30% increase in our power requirements by the year 2040. So we need to think about energy diversification. We need to get all the horses running in the race so that, we have a lot of options on the table to make decisions.
I agree. I just want to explain to our listeners here that I've got a bit of a cold. I wasn't really up last night drinking whiskey and smoking cigarettes or anything. So just bear with me. I know it sounds a little rough. Now, I just want to step back for a little bit because in Ontario, and we're hearing a lot about this right now, the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario about critical minerals, but the global Ring of Fire is a series of nations, of which we're sort of one, that has a lot of potential when it comes to geothermal capacity, just because, you look at the West Coast and up to BC and New Zealand and other places. What are you doing in Saskatchewan if you need to be closer to the water?
That's right. Oh,
I love our home province.
We're certainly nowhere near the Ring of Fire. There's no volcanoes in Saskatchewan. It's what we're developing is actually considered blind geothermal. There's no geysers, there's no fissures. It's sedimentary in nature. Essentially, you think of the deeper you go in the earth, the hotter it gets. And we have this unique geological situation in Saskatchewan where we can go 3.5 kilometers down and still be in sediment. Most places you're going to hit.
So it's easy. So it's easy to drill down, is what is
right. We're not targeting granite, right? I mean, this is or volcanic resources. It's kind of funny when you stand out in the middle of a field near Torquay, Saskatchewan. The last thing you think about is the potential for a really hot geothermal resource below your feet.
Right.
Here's the irony that I love, is that we wouldn't know this resource even existed if it weren't for the decades of oil and gas exploration in the region. And all of that data becomes public in Saskatchewan, right? So we were able to go exploring using computer software versus at the early stage.
So you are a geologist. So when, and I know this project's been on your front burner for quite a few years now.
Yes.
When did the penny drop? Like what was that moment of going, oh my God, it's right in front of us. Why aren't we doing this?
Right. So, I mean, fortunate to work in a province that is rich in many resources. I've worked in oil and gas. I've worked in diamond exploration. And I was actually been working on a coal project, believe it or not, near Hudson Bay. And it was a project that was riddled with challenges. Number one, that's coal. And I was commiserating with a very well-known geologist, my co-founder, Steve Halibura, who's well-known in Saskatchewan on potash and helium projects. And it was Steve that turned to me and said, Kirsten, what if we just stop the train? Let's just think about the typical geologist where, we go exploring for resources, we hopefully find them, we mine them out of the ground, we burn them up, and we go back and keep looking for more. Right. What if we could take that experience and skill set and deploy that on a virtually inexhaustible supply of energy, which is geothermal?
So you keep putting the water, the brine, the solution that you bring up that has this heat, and you take the heat out and then you put it back in the ground cold and heats up again. And I mean, it just seems like a no-brainer.
Well, it hasn't been easy.
No, I know. I'm not going to say that, but honestly, if it was there all the time, you can see that when you have a virtuous cycle like that, it just, how come nobody thought of it?
Because it's been hard, right? We've got a long history of being able to develop oil and gas resources. People have known how to do that. Right. Geothermal was hard. It was hard to even get our first well drilled. We talk about, funding support that we're seeing in the US. Well, Deep was actually very, very fortunate back in 2018, announced in 2019 to receive over $25.5 million of federal funding through Natural Resources Canada, and they continue to support the project.
Wow. Okay, that's great.
That funding was so key in allowing the investor risk tolerance to pass that inflection point, to be able to invest dollars into Deep so we could actually drill these very expensive wells. Prior to that federal commitment, we could not raise the capital. It was just too much risk and too much cost. So that inflection point,
it's costly at the front end, but then it sort of becomes free down the way.
With no commodity risk, right?
Yeah.
There's no commodity risk on geothermal power. No, it has been
getting
expensive.
People to put money on the table at the front end, I can see, is difficult. So I don't hear much from the federal government about this. I hear a lot of focus on now these days post-budget critical minerals, and from time to time, and certainly solar and wind, but somebody should be kind of screaming from the rooftops here. We've got this project in Saskatchewan, and we've got 4 or 5 other places in the country where we could potentially do that, where you're not drilling through rock for 3 miles.
That's right. That's right. We've been very fortunate on that. And that was that program that we were fortunate. It was the Emerging Renewable Power Program. And it was key in that it was for the first time that geothermal didn't have to compete with pre-existing mature renewables like wind and solar. So, it was the first project they announced was actually a tidal power project in the Bay of Fundy. And then we were second. So.
Wow. So is that one operating in the Bay of Fundy? What status does it have?
Oh, Pamela, I have not kept up to speed on that one. I don't recall.
So you and Deep and this project you're doing, where are you? Is this real? Are you heating a home? Is there anything actually happening, or are you still in the build process?
It's finally real. We have drilled 6 wells since 2018, 5 of them vertical. We drilled the first ever horizontal geothermal well in the world. And this is again going back to the help that we received from the Western Canadian oil field sector, is that we drilled these vertical wells.
Yeah.
And we were challenged to produce the fluids at the rate that we needed to be economic.
Yeah.
And it was the oil and gas sector that tapped us on the shoulder and said, well, we can help with that, right? We know how to produce fluids using conventional horizontal drilling. We've done
oil sands technology for sure. Yeah.
Right. In some ways, geothermal is very comparable to SAGD in some ways.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've done our homework. We've done the research, and while we are financially positioned to go into construction for the first 25 megawatts of power. Now, for your listeners, a megawatt of power is approximately equivalent to 1,000 households.
Okay.
So 25 megawatts is approximately equivalent to 25,000 households. We're going to do this first phase it's going to be in 2 phases. We're building a 5 megawatt demonstration facility to, let's be honest and transparent, to capture any expensive learnings that we may not have thought of on the small scale, so that the commercial build-out can optimize on those learnings.
So, but you're not putting anything into the grid just yet?
Not yet. No, we're not, but we will be on that first 5 megawatts. We have a contract to sell that power to SaskPower.
So that's kind of key.
Yeah.
SaskPower stepped up and said, if you build it, we will buy it.
That's right. Yeah, it's exciting. And the growth potential is huge. We talk about phases, but we have approximately 100,000 acres of resource space. It could be, we think about pore space. It could be one of the largest contiguous blocks of pore space that we're going to be using for geothermal, probably one of the largest blocks in North America. So our long-term growth strategy, is probably about 200 megawatts of power, maybe more. We don't want to oversell it too soon, but there's other economic opportunities here that can be worked in addition to power sales. We talked about our cold fluid being at 60 degrees Celsius going back into the ground, but we can utilize that fluid for direct heating opportunities, such as, let's say, greenhouses on the very large commercial scale, not small, but this large commercial scale where the economics can work for geothermally heated, produce, right?
So let me see if I've got this. So you'll take it out of the ground, you'll get the heat to generate the electricity that you'll put into the system. And then as you're running it back into the ground to be reheated, you can run it under a greenhouse, because it doesn't have to be at 75 degrees. It can be at 60 degrees.
Exactly.
Wow.
The size of these fluids, the amount of fluids that we're producing at the rates that we're producing, really these greenhouses could be scalable into, it starts to sound a bit arm wavy, but the square kilometer size type facilities, because we're moving such huge amounts of fluid.
And I mean, I've talked to lots of, there's an entrepreneur in Saskatchewan that wants to do that because the cost of transport, of getting fresh fruit and vegetables to Saskatchewan, especially with the carbon tax on the price of fuel, if we grew them closer to home, it would keep food costs down dramatically.
And create jobs.
Yeah.
And, encourage our Canadian food security, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I had a choice of buying a strawberry at the same price from Saskatchewan or Mexico, I'm going to buy Saskatchewan, made in Canada.
No, and it really does fit into the larger belief, I think, that a lot of people have. They don't want to buy their stuff from China. Everybody's kind of looking at home shoring a little bit more if they can. I've got to say, we do a lot of politics and issues on this podcast, and I always come away kind of shaking my head going, oh, what is going to happen? And I'm so excited about this. Like, it really does seem like an amazing idea. And just to say, if we hadn't had all those other industries and potash, and if we didn't have the kind of soil composition and all of that, I mean, you just don't think of geothermal water in Saskatchewan. It's just great idea. So glad that you got very well trained at the University of Saskatchewan.
My profs may argue that.
And then just had the good sense to sit around and think this one through. You could be a game changer, as they say.
Well, we've worked hard. We've got a great team. The large win here, Pamela, is, wouldn't it be wonderful we could use this horizontal well design, power generation configuration to be transferable, down to the States and around the world. It's pretty unique.
It's just amazing. Kirsten, thank you so much. Kirsten Marcia, President, CEO, and founder of DEEP, D-E-E-P, Deep Earth Energy Production Company. Great new idea. So in just a minute, we'll be back with her friend, Mike Crabtree, from Saskatchewan Research Council. We've spoken with Mike before, and he's just going to give us a bit of an update on where we are with critical minerals. We're all going to need them. We're going to have all those batteries and plug in the vehicles that Kirsten's going to make sure we have the electricity for. Thanks so much. Great to meet you.
Great to meet you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Talk again soon. Stay with us. We'll be right back. So as Kirsten just said, the race for energy alternatives is a very competitive one. And as promised, we're going to switch our focus a little bit now onto critical minerals. A couple of years ago, we met this incredible man in Saskatchewan, Mike Crabtree from Newcastle upon Tyne, where he got his education. In real life, he's actually the president CEO of the Saskatchewan Research Council, and this has been his focus. He actually says that Saskatchewan is set to become a super supplier for critical minerals, and maybe one day will displace China. Mike, great to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back. It's great to have got through COVID and still be here.
I know, because that's what it was. It was 21, and we didn't even know we were sitting across a table and not shaking hands and doing all of that stuff so that we didn't kill each other. So this is great. Now, budgets federally, budgets provincially. Saskatchewan has released a kind of a master plan to boost the critical mineral industry. Where are we? Have we actually found them? Can we actually get them out of the ground? Can we actually, provide the batteries and build the batteries that everybody's going to need by next Tuesday, given the timeline on EVs?
Well, I think it's interesting in the sense that we're using this collective term critical minerals.
Right.
And depending upon which jurisdiction you sit in, there's 29 or there's 31 or there's 36.
Okay, I've only got about 6 or 7 here: lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, zinc. Those are the main guys?
Those are the subset of critical minerals called battery minerals.
Okay.
Yeah. There's the broader collection, which includes things including things like carbon and uranium and potash in this province and potash, and then the rare earths. So it's becoming, you ain't nobody until you're a critical mineral, and you better get on that list. So
I want to be on that list. Okay.
I want to be on the list. I think I should be personally a critical mineral. No, seriously. So there are on that critical mineral list, there are things like copper. Right. So copper is a critical mineral, but copper, we've been mining and processing copper as a species for nearly 3,000 years, or for 3,000 years. Things like lithium, we have had a focus on for some decades. And of course, it's now hockey sticking in terms of what the demand is for all the reasons that we know. And then there are things like rare earths. So if we look at this critical minerals piece, there is the existing critical minerals that have become critical because there's either a scarcity of them or the demand is increasing dramatically as we move into the energy transition. There are the emerging critical minerals that are now very specific components of that energy transition that have emerged in recent decades. So I think it's important to sort of think of that as emerging and existing critical minerals.
And then you put rare earth in kind of a separate category.
Well, rare earths are very much an emerging critical mineral.
Okay. So
critical minerals. And coming into our consciousness in the West, if you like, critical minerals really is only in the last 5 or 10 years, or maybe a little longer, been something that we've really focused on. We've utilized them for many decades, but in terms of their criticality, probably only the last 10 years or so.
Well, that's interesting, because what Kirsten was just saying is, they wouldn't have been on the whole geothermal thing if they didn't have oil and gas and potash, and if we hadn't drilled down, nobody really would have thought of geothermal, but we had to do all of those things to realize what was underneath.
To realize that it was a resource.
Right.
And, critical minerals, maybe, 15 or 20 years ago, they'd be used in your camera, in your calculator. There's be a few specialist uses for rare earth magnets. Now they are the essential component, if you like, of things like wind turbines, but electric vehicles and into robotics. So, rare earths now have moved from being a sort of raw material that was important but not critical to now being absolutely critical to that energy transition. So that's why they have ramped up that list really, 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 really quickly.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question which you may or may not want to answer, because of course you work for the Research Council, but a lot of people are starting to talk now and say, look, we kind of got ahead of ourselves. Everybody was going to have an EV by tomorrow and this and that. Well, if you live in Wadena, Saskatchewan, or at Fishing Lake, you're not going to have an EV because they're not ready for prime time. There's nowhere to charge them. And the batteries don't last long enough and all of that kind of stuff. Are the timelines going to have to change in order for you to unearth the rare earth minerals?
I think that's a question that what we're seeing there is jurisdictional perspective. And I'll put this in, and as you know, Saskatchewan is the center of the known universe.
Yes,
but it only has a highly valued population of 1.1, 1.2 million.
Right.
And yet, is it going to be the EV users center of the universe? No. However, large population centers where EVs are much, much more attractive, and that's what's going to drive the global demand for electric vehicles. So, for example, China, which produces the vast majority of electric vehicles, produced 6.2 million in 2020, 2021. That is going to go up by many factors, an order of magnitude in the next 10 years. So Ford, Mercedes, GM, all of these companies now are gearing up for the EV transition that is going to occur in the next 10 years. And the requirement for lithium, for battery minerals, that cobalt, nickel, copper that you talked about just before, and rare earths is going to go up in proportion to that demand.
But part of the issue, and the reason I raise the timelines, is things happen. The two Michaels happen. Election interference allegations happen. And then all of a sudden we don't want to do business with China. We want to home shore or friend shore. So we've got to do it ourselves, because nobody wants an EV with, human rights issues attached to it.
And I think that is going to be true. How much of that is in the public consciousness at the moment? So you and I buy an EV, and we just feel generally good about it because we're not buying gas and we're not polluting, generating CO2. I think in the medium term, we're going to be looking under the hood and saying, where did that lithium come from? Where did those rare earths come from? Where did those critical minerals come from? I think that's a little bit down the road. Okay. I think what is driving this, Senator, is not so much public opinion yet, or even commerce and investment. It is governments who are seeing that if you have a jurisdiction like China that is so dominant in the provision of critical minerals and that are going to be so important to our economies in the next 10 or 20 years, you cannot have a situation where we're held hostage to fortune on that. So we have to develop ahead of time our own capabilities, because this, creation of mines for this is a 7 to 15 year horizon with current regulatory requirements. Building of the plants like SRC is a 5 to 6 year horizon. So you've got to start now ahead of the demand.
Well, that's exactly the point. I mean, we've got the whole issue of the regulatory process, Bill 69, which many people call there'll never be another pipeline bill, but it is got a lot of rules around it, and it's being challenged in the court. The Indigenous community is reacting, saying that critical minerals fall under treaty law. So there are a whole bunch of roadblocks, never mind the politics surrounding China.
There are. And I think that, as an old friend of mine used to say, it's even worse than that.
Right.
It's one of the, it is going to be very attractive from an investment standpoint to invest in critical minerals, particularly the emerging ones. And already lithium is taking off. Some of the things like rare earths, it's interesting, because China manipulates and suppresses the market, it tends to scare off private investment. And they are the PRC is very gifted at that in terms of manipulating the market so that one part of the market is clearly uneconomic to invest in.
Right.
And so the role of government really is to kickstart that by de-risking those investments. So even private equity and venture, things like rare earths and some of the other critical minerals, are outside of their risk return on investment envelope. So that's why I'm often asked, why is government taking a lead in this? And if this is so great, why isn't private equity, private investment just rushing into this? And it's because they would rather invest in things like lithium or copper or software than some of the more emerging rare earths because of that volatility. So the role of government is to de-risk that and take a leadership role, which is what Saskatchewan government has done specifically with
and the front end cost, which is higher, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's absolutely a good look at the context of the situation that we're in. So here's my question. What have we got?
What have we got? Are you thinking in Saskatchewan? We have,
and then we'll go to Canada, but we're doing homeland first.
Homeland first. So Saskatchewan is blessed with 23 plus of the 31 critical minerals right across that spectrum there. So we are already producing things like helium and of course uranium and potash. We will be central in things like copper and nickel. So those battery minerals that you were talking about before, we're either there or we have clear routes to being able to produce these in the near future. Lithium is another area that we will be a very significant producer of lithium in a different way from other jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions look at separating hard rock mining of lithium. So, for example, in Eastern Canada, here we will be separating lithium from deep, hot brines. You were talking with Kirsty around that. The same resource that she is using for powering geothermal will be a similar resource to lithium miners. Will be using that, separating the lithium from that water, and then re-injecting the water back down. So a very, very efficient process. So Saskatchewan has some major existing critical minerals production. Ones that are developing our own rare earths piece, and then future in terms of things like lithium.
And I'm assuming that process is a lot easier than digging through and down through the Canadian Shield and the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario.
I think it's some of the challenges here in Canada are as much regulatory as anything else. So having a jurisdiction that is an extraction friendly province, which is what Saskatchewan is, where we see the benefits not only to Saskatchewan, commercially and economically, but to the energy transition, from a Canadian and global standpoint. So Saskatchewan is really playing its role in making it an easier place to work. Now, that doesn't mean that the rules or the regulations are any less stringent. It's just that government of Saskatchewan has taken an approach to make that as easy as possible for incoming investment to engage with.
Yeah, and trying and merging provincial rules and federal rules and all of that, so you don't have to fill out the same pieces of paper 100 times.
Exactly, and making it so that, and you hear this all the time, particularly from our colleagues in the Ministry of Energy and Resources. When you call them, when you pick up the phone, it's not a how can we impose some regulations on you? It's how can we help?
Yeah.
Where are your issues, and how can we help you?
And we'll try and fix it. You raised an interesting point, which we touched on briefly with Kirsten too, which is everybody talks about this transition from the fossil fuel sector into whatever it may be, geothermal, critical, and we keep hearing, the government got into some trouble by talking about the fact that they would just, the oil and gas workers could become any old thing, right? They're not all going to be coders. Some may have to be janitors, etc. But in fact, when you look at what she's talking about, when you're talking about, we've already got a highly developed skill set for this kind of extraction of this kind of important, set of game changers here.
Yeah, exactly. And, I like you, I'm not somebody who believes that, the oil and gas industry is going to stop next year. This is a transition, not a cliff. If you want to ask the consequences of shutting off hydrocarbons, go ask the Europeans what their recent experience of that is. So this is a transition. We are looking to accelerate the transition, but to your point, these are not sit at the desk computer type jobs. These are industrial, mechanical, construction, all of the things that we do very, very well in the oil and gas sector. So that transition of the labor force is not a nice to have, it's an absolute necessity. If you ask SRC or any of the commercial companies that are operating in engineering or mining or industrial production, what keeps their CEOs awake at night? It's how do we get people? How do we get good qualified people? So, I am least concerned about that transition in terms of to good quality jobs, because there are more positions already available than there are people that we're finding to fill them.
Well, I think that's the issue. I mean, when people have been scared out of an industry, like oil and gas, which is we're coming to get you, we're going to shut you down, it is not surprising that many of them are not seeking their future in that business. Yeah, they may have moved on. I wanted to just ask too, because the nuclear question always comes up, right? And Saskatchewan's very involved in that with the small reactors, the movable ones that you could take to a site, to a plant, and use them, and it would be clean energy. Is that part of what you're doing? Do you see that as coming into the future plan before critical minerals, at the same time, along with geothermal? Like, where are we on the? Yeah, you can see the little horses coming out of them.
I think this is what makes this whole transition so challenging, is that the raw materials necessary for that energy transition do not spring carbon free from the ground. These are traditional mining and processing operations that tend to be traditionally carbon intensive. In order to create the vehicles, the wind turbines, the robots, all of the things that are going to represent the energy transition. So the end users, the OEMs, the companies that are going to manufacture the cars, and you and I as consumers are going to demand that those very industries are themselves low carbon intensity.
Correct, yeah.
So we are in the situation of extracting the minerals to make the things that make us low carbon intensive, at the same time as making those extraction industries net zero or approaching net zero. And this is very, very real now, because end users, like the car companies, like the manufacturers of pretty much everything, are saying, yes, we want this because we're going to make a low carbon intensity product, but we want to see what is your plan to move to net zero?
Yeah.
As an extractor. So renewables have a place, wind and solar, but we know what the challenges are on that. When the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine. So the need for carbon net zero baseload, if you're blessed with hydro, absolutely. But the obvious one is nuclear. Yeah. And nuclear in terms of utility scale, which we've talked about before, the big 1,000 megawatt reactors, but also these small ones, these mobile ones. Not mobile, transportable, I should say.
Transportable, yeah.
Yeah, if I say mobile, I'll get in terrible trouble. These transportable ones are going to play a key role, particularly for remote communities and particularly for mine sites that want to get to that net zero. So that was a long-winded explanation.
But it's a good one, because if you want to go to the potash mine and do this separate kind of extraction process, they're already doing what they're doing, but you want to add this other element to it. You're going to have to supplement it in terms of energy. I mean,
our customers as a province for our raw materials are saying to us, what is your plan for net zero? When will you be completely net zero? What is the transition to net zero? And you'll hear companies say, well, our plan is to be completely net zero by 2030 or 2035 or 2040, and here is the plan. That is becoming one of the essential components to justify subsequent investment.
Is our governments, let me put it that way, I think you can look at them separately, are governments getting that this process is coming together, but time is of the essence, and that governments have to move faster than they generally do? I think it's easier for a province, maybe harder for a federal government.
and I think that's true. So I think the immediate answer to that is yes. I think government, both at a federal level and a provincial level, is really getting that now. Really gets it. And I think to some extent that's ahead of public opinion. And it is because their advisors are saying to them, look, here's the consequences of not doing this for us as a country and for our individual jurisdictions. And it comes back to that investment and leadership piece here.
Right.
So whereas maybe, when we were last having not dissimilar conversation a few years back, I would say they're not getting it yet. It's not happening. I think that we are seeing both federal government and certainly Saskatchewan provincial government really getting that not only do we have to put these sort of incentives and leadership in place, but we need to do it quickly. I think this is a global race.
Yeah, there's two things about public opinion, and one of them is, Canada's overall contribution to the degradation of the planet is pretty minuscule when you look at China and India and big players. So they have to, be realistic in what they're asking consumers to do, because we're not the big causers of the problem, if I can put it that way. And secondly, just the whole issue of, we're all smart, and so you're telling me I have to have an EV by 2025 or 2026, but how are you going to fill that demand when you haven't put the building blocks together? There's no place to charge the car. There's not enough stuff for the batteries. Like, we can be critical too of these lofty demands and flowery statements that we hear from governments in press conferences and budgets. But come on, guys, if you want us to do this, then get all the pieces in place, which means you do have to move faster.
And you do have to move faster. And if you're talking to experts in this field, which I am not, but if you talk to experts in this field, one of the biggest concerns they have is not the electric vehicles or the construction of the sufficient number of electric vehicles to meet the demand, not even really the charging stations, because you can just build more charging stations. It's the electrical power. It's the electrical power to be able to feed those stations in that demand. Because effectively what we're doing is we're taking our transport system from a hydrocarbon supply chain that has been developed over the last 100+ years, which is incredibly efficient, and then putting that demand onto our electrical grid system, which has not had the same level of investment and is already stressed by the modern demand for power. So really, it is the generating capacity and capability, and of course, coming back to what we said just before, the fact that we're demanding it not only that generating capacity, but the fact it has to be green and it has to be net zero.
Well, no, and look, we've seen it in California in real time. They crashed the grid. And asking people to go and find their fuel, their fuel-based car and try and use that to get around. We're not quite there.
And I don't want to sound too negative on this, because there are some really, really interesting technologies coming into play that are going to partly mitigate this. So, for example, and you'll have heard this before, your electric vehicle that you charge in your garage overnight, it will take the charge, but then it will also be able to donate power back to the grid at the points of peak times. So there was a really interesting discussion at a conference I was recently at, where school buses in the US are going to go electric very rapidly in the next 5 years plus. But these school buses will be charged overnight, and then in the morning, before they're used, they will put power back to the grid, or in the afternoon where they've still got charge, they will be putting power back to the grid. What that can do is save an awful lot of additional generating capacity that you would otherwise have to put in place to cover peak load. So technology is going to play a huge role in mitigating some of this, these peak demands.
I made a note to myself, and I'm not sure what the question is. Taiwan and South Korea. So are we going to try and build up our relationships with them on this whole process as suppliers and builders, and try and disassociate from China a bit because they're safer, like we trust them more? What kind of relationship do we have there? I don't know why I wrote myself that note, but it's there.
Yeah, I got to be really careful that I don't get into sort of a policy or
okay,
overtly political piece on that. But I'll talk it a little bit in general, because this is strategy. Is weaning ourselves off the dominance of China,
right? Okay,
is going to be a really important piece, and this is why there is a global race. So there's a global race going on between those folks in the West who need to wean themselves off,
right.
And there's a global race between the West and China in terms of being that dominance in that in the market.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So that's part of the process. All right, so again, timeline, what are we talking about? This is, what are you confident in saying, where Saskatchewan is not going to just be a home to or holder of these key minerals, but we are going to be an active contributor? And I know some of them are already there, as you say, like copper and some of those things. But when are we going to become a major lithium contributor to the global system?
I think you're looking, we're looking in that 5 to 10 year horizon for things like lithium. I think that the challenges are all on primary extraction, is all about that approvals and regulatory process on that. And I think coming back to your prior question, I think government, both provincially and federally, are realizing that 10 to 15 years on average to get a new mine in place is not going to cut it. Right. We need to cut that substantially to be able to deliver what Canada needs to deliver to the rest of the world. But answering your question, I think lithium, the next 5 to 10 years, I think we are going live with our plant in 2024, with potential expansions right through to 2028. But I think you'll see mining of rare earths in the province is going to be in that sort of early 2030s because of that whole process that we talked about before. So again, that's sort of 10-year horizon.
It is just always so amazing to talk with you, all this stuff that's in your brain, but you give us hope that there's a way to do this properly, and not leave people behind, and not be unrealistic in our goals, and try to accomplish everything together. You know, I think that's the frustration a lot of people have, which it can't be either or. We kind of have to move in tandem on this.
And I think, you know, when we spoke a few years back, I was sort of a little sort of skeptical that we would sort of get all of the things pointed in the right direction. I'm really now much more optimistic, both on a federal level and definitely on a provincial level. And I can see that this is not going to be easy. This is going to be transitions are never easy.
No, exactly.
But there's going to be some big winners, and there's going to be some losers in that, inevitably of that. But I can see a route through to a successful transition, particularly for Canada. And Canada is going to be in a superb position to be able to provide resources, expertise, finished products for that transition.
And I put this, I thought I wasn't going to ask you another question, but now I am, because we're seeing two different approaches from the US and from Canada in terms of this, and we're behind. We've been running behind in terms of the incentive system. But have we got an edge on any in this particular field?
You know, again, I was down at the SAFE conference in Washington, D.C. last week. And prior to that, I thought that, you know, the US is the classic sleeping giant, and it's really not waking up to this. Boy, with the IRA have they woken up to this?
Exactly.
And it's one of those things where you sit in those conferences and it was just speaker after speaker after speaker saying how they were deploying billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions into this, and everything from school buses to behind the meter monitoring of your electric vehicle through to nuclear generation. And the US under the Biden administration's IRA is really waking up to this.
Yeah.
And I think that what we have to hang on to the coattails of that and slipstream that. And
get our act together.
And get our act, and to be fair, getting our act together, but saying the US is doing this. How do we leverage?
Right. Absolutely. That? Yeah, absolutely. Mike, great. Thank you. So you went from, cautiously optimistic to optimistic. So if we call you back in another 24 months, 2 years, are you going to be ecstatically happy and declare we're the center of the universe for real?
Well, I think I've already stated definitively that we're the center of the universe. What you will see in 24 months is us having delivered on our plans and probably lost the remainder of my hair in that process. But yes, I think optimistic for Canada and very optimistic for Saskatchewan.
I know people sometimes get sick of me talking about that, but we get short shrift in the general national conversations on newscasts and newspapers. So this is a good place to do it. Thanks.
Absolutely.
We'll talk to you again soon. Mike Crabtree is the president and CEO of the Saskatchewan Research Council. And you know what he's doing because you just heard it. So we'll talk to you again soon, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. See you soon.